If you had asked an American in 1964 why the dimes and quarters in their pocket felt different from the ones produced in 1965, they probably would have repeated what they heard on the evening news. There was a coin shortage. The official explanation from Washington sounded straightforward and reasonable. Authorities insisted that coin collectors, vending machines, and a rapidly expanding economy were absorbing loose change faster than the U.S. Mint could manufacture it. To protect the nation's commerce, President Lyndon B. Johnson introduced what he presented as a bold and necessary fix, the Coinage Act of 1965. This legislation removed the 90% silver content from dimes and quarters and replaced it with a layered combination of copper and nickel, base metals that carried virtually no intrinsic worth. The change was marketed as a simple logistical improvement, a practical adjustment to meet growing demand. But like many official explanations from that era, this narrative concealed a far more troubling economic truth. America was not facing a shortage of coins, it was confronting a shortage of real money. Silver was not removed because of vending machines or collectors. It was removed because of an unavoidable economic principle known as Gresham's Law. Gresham's Law states that bad money drives good money out of circulation. When a government mandates that two forms of currency circulate at the same face value, yet one contains valuable metal and the other consists of inexpensive paper or base metal, people will naturally save the valuable currency and spend the cheaper one. By the early 1960s, the United States was stepping directly into this trap. At the time, the U.S. dollar was tied to silver at a fixed rate of $1.29 per ounce. As long as silver traded below that threshold, a silver dollar held more value as currency than as raw metal. But global industry was accelerating. Demand for silver in photography, electronics, and battery production was surging, steadily driving up the world market price. Inside the Treasury, concern was mounting. Officials understood that if silver rose above $1.38 per ounce, the metal content in a single quarter would exceed its 25-cent face value. At that moment, every American would have a financial incentive to melt down their coins and sell the metal to refiners. The nation's currency would quite literally disappear into furnaces. To prevent this scenario, the Treasury began aggressively dumping its own silver reserves onto the market, attempting to suppress prices and keep silver artificially anchored at $1.29. But this strategy was unsustainable. They were hemorrhaging millions of ounces each week in a desperate effort to hold back market forces. Eventually, policymakers realized that unless they removed silver from circulation, unless they broke the connection between the dollar and precious metal, the government's strategic silver reserves would be exhausted within a matter of months. In that light, Lyndon B. Johnson's public remarks when signing the Coinage Act of 1965 stand as one of the most calculated deceptions in presidential history. Facing television cameras, LBJ displayed the new copper-nickel coins, mockingly labeled Johnson's sandwiches by critics, and addressed the nation. He assured Americans that there was no reason to hoard silver coins. He declared that the Treasury possessed ample silver reserves and would use them to maintain silver's price in line with its value in circulating coinage. According to him, there would be no profit in holding coins for their metal content. It was a bluff. The government did not possess sufficient silver to control the price indefinitely. Just 3 years later, in 1968, the fixed price was abandoned entirely. Silver prices surged dramatically. Those who trusted the president's reassurance and spent their 1964 quarters saw the purchasing power of those coins erode by roughly 90%. Those who ignored the warning, held on to their silver coins, and either stored or melted them, realized substantial gains. The alleged coin shortage was merely the pretext. The true event was a quiet default on the silver standard. In 1964, the U.S. dollar completed its transformation from a tangible store of value into a purely debt-backed instrument. Silver coinage had been the final restraint on the government's capacity to inflate the currency. In 1965, that restraint was deliberately removed. To grasp the full scale of what occurred, one must look beyond the coins themselves and examine the broader global economic landscape in which the United States was steadily losing ground. The elimination of silver was not a minor administrative adjustment. It marked the inevitable breakdown of a long-running price control scheme orchestrated by the Treasury. By fixing silver at $1.29 per ounce, the United States was effectively subsidizing international markets. It amounted to a reverse corner of the silver trade. Ordinarily, a monopolist attempts to drive prices higher to maximize profits. In this situation, however, the U.S. government, holder of the largest silver reserves ever assembled, used its dominance to force prices downward. Why would a nation intentionally sell its strategic assets below their true market value? The answer rests in maintaining the illusion of stability. The dollar's credibility depended on a powerful promise. Internationally, it was said to be as reliable as gold, and at home, as solid as silver. If silver's market price began to rise, it would immediately signal that the dollar was losing purchasing power. It would expose the inflation being generated by the Federal Reserve to finance the expanding welfare programs of the Great Society and the escalating costs of the Vietnam War. To conceal that inflation, policymakers needed to silence the signal. They had to suppress the very indicator that revealed the problem. Keeping silver artificially cheap became essential. But this approach created a deeply distorted system of incentives that steadily drained the nation's reserves. By fixing silver at $1.29 per ounce, the U.S. Treasury effectively told the world, "We will sell you unlimited silver at this price, regardless of demand." Predictably, the offer was exploited. Major industrial corporations, such as Eastman Kodak, which required enormous quantities of silver for photographic film, benefited immensely. These companies were able to purchase silver from the Treasury at the artificially low fixed rate, even as real global demand suggested a much higher value. In effect, they were receiving a hidden subsidy. Foreign governments also took advantage, exchanging their paper dollars for American silver bullion and quietly transferring wealth from U.S. vaults into their own reserves. Speculators recognized the opportunity as well. Investors who understood the numbers saw that the Treasury stockpile was limited. They borrowed dollars, purchased silver at the fixed $1.29 rate, and simply waited. Once the government's supply ran dry, prices would inevitably rise. It was a trade with virtually no downside. The magnitude of the outflow was extraordinary. In the late 1950s, the U.S. Treasury controlled more than 2 billion ounces of silver. By 1965, that reserve had fallen to alarmingly low levels. A full-scale run on the Treasury had begun. Day after day, trucks departed the West Point Depository, carrying silver bars that would never be replenished. The government was effectively selling off the family heirlooms to cover the mounting expenses of the Vietnam War. Had silver not been removed from coinage in 1965, the Treasury would have been depleted entirely. If reserves had reached zero, the consequences would have been catastrophic. Silver certificates circulating at the time, the Blue Seal and Red Seal notes previously discussed, would have defaulted. The Coinage Act of 1965 functioned as an emergency measure. It was, in essence, the government admitting that it could no longer honor its obligations in precious metal. That retreat was formalized in June 1968, 3 years after silver coins were replaced. This marked the final opportunity for Americans to redeem their silver certificates for physical bullion. For decades, a $1 silver certificate guaranteed the bearer $1 worth of silver. After June 24, 1968, that guarantee was terminated. The certificate effectively became indistinguishable from a Federal Reserve note, paper sustained solely by confidence. In the final days before the deadline, long lines formed outside assay offices in San Francisco and New York. Citizens rushed to exchange their paper for small bags of silver granules as the Treasury had already exhausted its supply of bars and coins. Those who failed to act were left with nothing more than symbolic paper. Those who secured the metal witnessed its value surge. By 1980, silver, once officially valued at $1.29, was trading at $50 per ounce or more. Americans who trusted government currency saw their purchasing power eroded by roughly 97% relative to silver. Those who held on to the metal preserved their wealth. This shift permanently changed the mindset of American savers. Prior to 1965, saving often meant physically storing coins. A jar filled with quarters represented a store of silver. It was tangible wealth, resistant to inflation. You did not need access to financial institutions or investment accounts to protect your purchasing power. A simple piggy bank was enough. After 1965, however, Accumulating coins became financially irrational. The new clad coins, composed of copper and nickel, were made from metals so plentiful that they offered no hedge against inflation. As a result, the middle class was pushed into the formal financial system. If currency itself could no longer preserve value, savings had to be redirected into financial products, bank accounts, bonds, equities. Individuals were compelled to entrust their capital to banks, which would then deploy it into the broader credit system. The option of acting as one's own central bank effectively disappeared. This marked the financialization of the American household. A culture once built on independent savers gradually transformed into one reliant on investment returns, forced to pursue yield in the stock market simply to maintain purchasing power. Moreover, the debasement of coinage laid the groundwork for the inflationary surge of the 1970s. Sustained double-digit inflation cannot coexist with money made of silver. If excessive paper currency is issued while coins still contain precious metal, Gresham's law activates immediately. The silver disappears from circulation and economic activity contracts. By eliminating silver from coins, the government removed that automatic restraint. It cleared the way for the Federal Reserve to expand the money supply without any physical limitation. The great inflation that battered the United States between 1971 and 1981, when consumer prices roughly tripled and interest rates surged to nearly 20%, could only unfold because the connection to silver had already been cut in 1965. Lyndon Johnson's copper-nickel sandwich coins planted the seeds of the stagflation that eroded middle-class wealth in the following decade. Officials pointed fingers at OPEC. They blamed organized labor. They accused corporate greed. Yet the underlying mathematical cause was the removal of a tangible anchor from the currency itself. The severity of this decision becomes even clearer when you recognize that policymakers fully understood the consequences. Internal Treasury memoranda from that era revealed deep concern that the public might recognize what was happening. Authorities launched aggressive messaging campaigns to discourage hoarding. Coin collectors were labeled unpatriotic. Lawmakers even debated and ultimately enacted restrictions on melting coins. In effect, they attempted to criminalize ordinary citizens for trying to shield themselves from inflation. The public was expected to treat a copper slug as if it were equivalent to a silver coin, while the government quietly offloaded genuine silver to industrial buyers. It represented a wealth transfer from individuals holding coins to large entities acquiring bullion. The Coinage Act of 1965 was not merely an administrative adjustment. It was a partial default. It amounted to a slow-motion bankruptcy. And the 1964 Kennedy half-dollar, the final circulating silver coin, stands today as a marker for the end of an era defined by sound money. The legacy of the 1965 Coinage Act is not confined to history books. Its consequences remain embedded in the economic system that shapes the price of everything you purchase today. To grasp the real impact of silver's removal, you only need to conduct a simple comparison. Consider a 1964 Washington quarter. At the time it was issued, it represented 25 cents in legal tender. In 1964, that quarter could purchase a gallon of gasoline. Fast forward to 2026. If you bring that same 1964 quarter to a coin dealer or refinery, its silver content is worth roughly 500 rubles. Now consider the current cost of a gallon of gasoline, approximately $5. In terms of silver value, the price relationship has barely changed over 6 decades. Measured in silver, gasoline requires roughly the same labor and resources to produce and deliver today as it did during Johnson's presidency. What has changed is not the commodity, but the measuring unit. The modern clad quarter, the copper-nickel coin in circulation, has forfeited about 95% of its purchasing power. The silver quarter has maintained essentially all of it. This straightforward comparison undermines the conventional narrative about inflation. Prices themselves are not inherently rising. The currency is losing value. Removing silver removed a transparent reference point. It was like smashing the thermometer so the room could be heated without visible proof. Today we appear to be approaching a modern version of 1965. Once again, Gresham's law is exerting pressure on U.S. coinage. But now the metals at stake are copper and nickel rather than silver. Just as the silver in a dime became too valuable to circulate in the 1960s, The intrinsic metal value of the modern 5-cent coin has at times exceeded its face value. Depending on commodity prices, the melt value of a standard U.S. nickel can fluctuate above 6 or 7 cents. This means the mint can lose money producing each one. This condition is known as negative seigniorage. It signals structural strain within a currency system. When it costs more to manufacture a coin than the coin represents, the arithmetic no longer works. History offers a predictable pattern. Eventually, the composition of the nickel will likely be altered, shifted toward cheaper materials such as steel or zinc, just as the penny transitioned from copper to zinc in 1982. When that change occurs, existing nickels will quickly vanish from everyday use. Individuals who understand Gresham's law will begin accumulating them in large quantities. They will serve as a low-cost store of metal value, a substitute for silver at the margins. The pattern is repeating itself, only with less valuable materials. Monetary debasement tends to continue until purchasing power is nearly extinguished. This ongoing erosion helps explain the rising interest in so-called constitutional silver, often mislabeled as junk silver. These are the dimes, quarters, and half dollars minted before 1965 that were removed from circulation. For years, they were treated casually as scrap metal, stacked in buckets at coin shops. Increasingly, they are viewed as a practical medium of exchange for individuals seeking autonomy. Their advantage lies in something modern bullion lacks: transactional flexibility. The removal of silver in 1965 also reshaped public psychology. Once society accepted that currency itself carried no inherent value, that it functioned purely as a government token, the eventual shift toward digital money became far easier to justify and implement. If a coin is nothing more than a cheap piece of copper, why bother carrying it at all? Why not rely entirely on a plastic card? Why not shift everything to a phone application? When the weight of solid money disappeared, something else vanished with it: privacy and the independence that comes from holding value in your own hands. The final phase of this progression is the central bank digital currency, or CBDC. The Coinage Act of 1965 stripped money of its soul by removing the silver. A CBDC strips away the body by eliminating cash altogether. It finalizes the shift from being an owner of assets to merely being a participant in a credit system. In 1964, holding a silver dollar meant possessing wealth that no authority could deactivate. It belonged entirely to you. In 2026, holding a digital dollar inside a CBDC wallet represents conditional access, access that can be restricted if you exceed a carbon limit or fall below an approved social standard. The journey toward digital dependency began the moment silver was extracted from the coinage. That moment trained the public to accept that money is defined by government decree rather than by market validation. Yet the silver market appears poised for a dramatic reckoning that could make 1964 seem insignificant by comparison. For 6 decades, silver prices have been heavily influenced through paper trading platforms such as COMEX, where vast quantities of synthetic silver contracts are exchanged to dampen the price of actual metal. This artificial pressure has helped sustain the appearance of dollar strength, but physical reality cannot be ignored indefinitely. Silver is not ornamental, it is strategic. It is indispensable for solar technology, electric vehicles, and advanced defense systems. Consumption is outpacing new mining production, and above-ground reserves are steadily diminishing. We are nearing a genuine physical shortage, not a manufactured narrative like the coin shortage of 1964, but a tangible supply constraint. When major industrial players such as Tesla, Samsung, or Raytheon struggle to secure the metal required for manufacturing, paper-based price suppression will unravel. The market will be forced to adjust to a level that reflects real-world supply and demand. Some observers believe that such a reset could push silver into triple-digit territory, $100, $200, or even higher. Should that occur, a 1964 quarter would not merely preserve value. It could outperform most conventional investments. It represents an asymmetric opportunity, minimal downside, since it retains at least its face value, and substantial upside if the dollar continues to weaken. The central lesson of 1965 is clear. Governments tend to break promises rather than submit to market discipline. They assured citizens that silver certificates were fully redeemable. That assurance proved false. They claimed the new coins were equivalent in value. That claim was misleading. They vowed to control silver prices. That effort ultimately failed. Today, similar assurances are offered about banking stability, temporary inflation, and the sustainability of social programs. History suggests those statements deserve the same caution you would apply to a 1965 Johnson sandwich. Waiting for official announcements of reform is rarely wise. By the time changes are declared, the redistribution of wealth has already occurred. The silver redemption window closed in 1968. The gold redemption window shut in 1971. The next closing window may be the opportunity to exit the dollar itself. Those who hold tangible assets, whether historic silver coins or decentralized forms of value, are the ones responding to the signal rather than the noise. The Coinage Act of 1965 was the initiating act. The inflationary decades that followed were the escape route, and the cost has been borne by you, unless you choose a different path.